So welcome everyone, and today I will be making a tier list discussing different countries' performances during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. And so as you can see here, we have a lot of countries to cover. This is more than I've ever done, more than like World War I or World War II. But that's why it's going to be interesting, and so let's get right into it. So, of course, just to give a little bit of context, right, when I discuss the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, I'm doing everything from the Haitian Revolution all the way up until the 100 Days. So, in other words, 1791 to 1815. So, unlike the last two streams, which covered just one war, this will be covering a series of wars. I don't even actually know how many, but in terms of the big ones, these are the War of the First Coalition, the War of the Second Coalition, the War of the Third Coalition, the War of the Fourth Coalition, the War of the Fifth Coalition, the War of the Sixth Coalition, the War of the Seventh Coalition, plus the Peninsular War and the French invasion of Russia. Those are the big wars, of course, but there are many others. There are side wars such as the Anglo-Swedish War, the War of 1812, like the First Serbian Uprising. There are a bunch of wars being covered here. So it's not just the coalition wars. These are also, other wars that all sort of meld in together, and so which can't really be extracted. So it will be quite a lot. Obviously, I don't need to go into detail about each war, but I will give some context because I understand not all of us might be super familiar with, each war and what happened. So let's start off just briefly explaining each war and the overall summary. So, the War of the First Coalition, what happened? Well, as you guys probably all know, right, in 1789, the French Revolution began because there were a bunch of social problems, and the final straw basically was when the king decided there was a big enough crisis. King Louis XVI decided that there was a big enough crisis that it needed to convoke the Estates General. And basically people were annoyed because there were three groups that were equally represented: the nobility, the clergy, and the common people. So in other words, the first, second, and third estate. The problem is that the first and second estates were only like 5% of the population, but got 67% of the vote. And so the third estate decided to make their own assembly, and then it quickly spiraled out of control. Eventually, they stormed the Bastille, right, which was sort of a symbol of royal authority, and then they forced the king to become a constitutional monarch in 1791. And actually, the French Revolutionary Wars really started in 1792 when they forced the king to declare war on Austria to prove his loyalty to the French people, but then afterwards he tried to escape to Austria, after which he was captured and later executed along with his wife Marie Antoinette. So that kind of was what triggered the War of the First Coalition, and then the War of the First Coalition was basically literally all of Europe ganged up on France to try to crush the revolution, and somehow France came on top. And I do say somehow, although in large part it was thanks to, one general, Napoleon, who basically had an insane and brilliant Italian campaign, and he basically mainly crushed the Austrians in that, but it was also all the French people in general, because they were facing, invasions from the south through Spain, invasions from the east, southeast through Italy, invasions from the east through like Switzerland and the Holy Roman Empire, and then invasions through the north from Austria and the Netherlands, and then of course Britain was also at war with them, although they don't share a land border, as you know. So it was crazy, and the French were able to win. In the War of the First Coalition, basically they were able to overrun Austria and Belgium. Then they crushed the Dutch Republic, turned it into a vassal state. They also crushed Switzerland. They took over northern Italy, forced Spain to switch sides so that it was now on the French side. And then at the end of that, there was peace, but that only lasted a year. Then the War of the Second Coalition started, and it was sort of the same thing. We saw Napoleon invading Egypt in order to basically cut off the links between Britain and India. And although that didn't work, it created a lot of, interesting cultural effects, such as the discovery of the Rosetta Stone and the creation of Egyptology as a field. Of course, this was in the Ottoman Empire, so that brought the Ottomans into the war as well. Also, France was having a hard time with its navy, so then it was getting into disputes with the U.S., which caused a quasi-war between the United States and between France. And so that was quite interesting how, you know, these kind of wars have global effects. But yeah, basically France won that war too. And then at the end of the war, Napoleon, because he was so successful and because the directory that ruled France at the time was terrible, he took over. And so that's considered the end of the French Revolutionary Wars, because the French Revolution ends in 1799, and then it is replaced with the Napoleonic Wars. So basically you get more coalitions. So during the War of the Third Coalition, it's like mainly Britain and Russia plus some allies going to war, and Austria as well. And during the War of the Third Coalition, Austria, you know, gets beaten pretty badly. The Fourth Coalition doesn't go well either. The French expand more, you know, in the Holy Roman Empire, which they actually dissolve, and then they create the Confederation of the Rhine, which is loyal to the French. At one point, Prussia was actually seeing how much France was advancing, and so they declare war on France, which I believe is the War of the Fifth Coalition, although let me just double check. Let's do this. War of the Fifth Coalition. Oh no. So yeah, it was the War of the Fourth Coalition. So yeah, during the War of the Third Coalition, right, Austria gets destroyed, Holy Roman Empire gets destroyed, Prussia gets worried, they declare war on France, start the War of the Fourth Coalition, and then they get absolutely smashed by France, and so they lose like half their land. And so then we get to the War of the Fifth Coalition, which is when Austria tried to declare war and they quickly got put back in place. And yeah, and then at that point, you know, France is kind of on top of the world. They have, you know, directly taken over like northern Italy, the left bank of the Rhine, or the west bank of the Rhine, I should say. You know, they've taken over the Netherlands. They forced Spain into alliance. Prussia and Austria are both very reluctant French allies. And the only main power opposing France at this point is the United Kingdom. And then what happens is that France is trying to defeat the United Kingdom by creating the continental system, which was where everyone in Europe would blockade the United Kingdom. But the problem is that there are two countries that don't want to do this. Well, sort of three. You have Portugal, you have the UK itself, of course, and you have Sweden. So Sweden is quickly dealt with. The Russians take Finland from them. But then Portugal is still not really compliant. So then basically Napoleon then invades Portugal, and he has a bunch of troops in Spain, of course, to invade Portugal. So he invades Portugal successfully, but then he uses the troops in Spain to try to take over Spain. The Spanish don't like this. This is the Peninsular War. So the Peninsular War starts in 1808. It's not going that great. And then another country starts also trying to skirt around the continental system, and this is Russia, which had never really been defeated that badly by France. And so France does not like this, so Napoleon raises the largest army in history up to that point, and then basically marches into Russia, hoping to force them to submit. But then, as we all know, right, the Russians use scorched earth tactics. You have the Battle of Borodino, which no one really wins. But most importantly, they burn down Moscow, so that by the time Napoleon takes it, it's just a ruin. So he's forced to retreat. He loses like 90% of his men. And then everyone's like, wait a second, Napoleon isn't that strong. So then the War of the Sixth Coalition starts. Prussia, Austria easily switch sides. I think the Ottomans did too. And then all these countries in the Confederation of the Rhine, as they notice that France is losing, they switch sides, they turn against France, and then everyone attacks France, and then they, you know, defeat Napoleon, and they exile him to Elba, and that's the end of the wars. Except, of course, that doesn't happen. Napoleon leaves from Elba, comes back to France, and then takes over, and everyone's like, nah. So then they declare war on Napoleon personally. That's the War of the Seventh Coalition, also known as the 100 Days, because it only really lasted about 100 days till Waterloo, and then he was exiled for good to St. Helena. And that is basically a summary of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. I understand that many of you guys already know the basic outline, but just wanted to, you know, clarify that first, and then we'll actually, you know, start ranking. So let's just check the comments real quick. Yeah. The Republic and the Empire should be two separate rankings. Now here's the thing, I was thinking about this, but in the same way I didn't separate the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars because they all kind of bled into each other. It's the same reason I'm not doing like a different, one for France as an empire and France as a republic. The Ottomans were neutral. They only fought in the War of the Second Coalition. Okay, good to know. I wasn't exactly sure of that. Also, one other thing, in terms of, okay, why have I put it this way? Right? Because someone was pointing out that France is first. Oh yeah, it's Common who was pointing out that France was first. So basically, this is roughly from most pro-French to most anti-French. And I'll explain how this works. Basically, here we have France. Here we have basically the client states that stayed loyal to France for the most part or were just dissolved. Denmark kind of was like France's only real solid ally. Like they were on the French side pretty much for the entire wars. So yeah, these are kind of like more Confederation of the Rhine. Then once we get to this area over here, so starting with Spain and kind of going up until the US here, these are all countries that kind of fought both the British and the French. And so these sides, not necessarily were all opportunists, but, depending on the circumstance, they could either be on the coalition side or on the revolutionary side. And then over here we have some countries that were really just fighting like one other country, and so they weren't really involved on one side or the other. Here we have countries that were basically just destroyed by the French, or were quickly knocked out and so weren't that relevant. So this is kind of all this area. And then starting here, especially with Hanover and Prussia up until Britain, these are the countries that were most often fighting the French. And Britain was the only country that was fighting France the entire time without a break, although Sweden and Portugal pretty much were never on the French side. So that's basically the overview of why I arranged these countries as they are. So we are, I don't know why I'm saying we, it's me. I am going to put France in A tier. Let's see. Just kidding. I'm putting in S tier. So why am I putting France in S tier? Well, essentially for the same reason that I don't want to send feedback. For the same reason that World Builders Ministries explained, and that is because France just was insane during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. I mean, it's already crazy enough that one country was able to beat all of Europe combined. All right? But the fact that they did that 5 different times is really mind-blowing. Now I understand that not every coalition they're fighting against all Europe. But the first coalition they definitely were, and I would say to a large extent so was the case in the second and the third coalitions. And, they're fighting a lot of countries in the fourth and fifth coalitions too. And then, even after being, smashed in the sixth coalition, they still had enough strength to fight Europe all over again during the 7th coalition. Now, I understand, we're going to get the people saying, no, but they lost, right? This is the same thing that happened, when I made my World War I and World War II tier list, where I put Germany in S tier. People are like, oh, but they lost. It's true they lost, but okay. Maybe the argument's somewhat more fair in World War I, and especially World War II, where Germany was crushed. But in the French Revolutionary Wars, these guys had to fight 7 coalitions to be fully crushed. Right? So I feel like that's not really comparable to World War II, where Germany fought 1 coalition and then they got destroyed. So that's one thing. The other thing too is just Napoleon himself was just insane. I mean, this guy basically single-handedly led the French to victory. Now I think the French would have won either way, at least in the short term. But with Napoleon, they made so much progress. They were, just marching into like Vienna. They were marching into Berlin. I mean, they even marched into Moscow for a little bit, even though that didn't work out in the end. But the French really were on it. And a big part of why they did that too is because they were more motivated. They had a real cause to fight for, and also because they used something called the levée en masse, which is basically that they would get everyone in the country, basically all fighting age males, to fight. And that is because France was experiencing nationalism for the first time. And so they believed that they were fighting for the French people and not for a king. And so therefore, all the French people were responsible for defending the country. And so when you combine that, everything I've said with the fact that the French also had the largest army in the world, the Grande Armée, the fact that they were able to defeat so many countries, force many to switch sides, it really is impressive. And truly, I don't think there's almost ever been any parallel to this in history, when you think about how much it took to crush the French. So I know, it's always funny because like during the World Wars, Tierlist people were saying like I'm a German fan. I actually don't like Germany really that much, and I like France even less. But I have to put my personal biases aside and just say, wow, like this truly was another level. So this is the Batavian Republic. So essentially what happened is in 1795, France conquers the Dutch Republic, and so they wanted to make a revolutionary sister republic, and so the Batavian Republic was the first sister republic of France. And it was, just the replacement of the Dutch Republic. However, the Batavian Republic had a horrible military history. They achieved basically nothing, and they were quite pathetic on the international scene. They fought in a couple of battles, but they lost pretty much all of them. So I'm going to be putting the Batavian Republic in F tier. Yeah. All right. Does anyone know what this next country is, by the way? Okay. Common knows, yes, it's Genoa. So it's not actually technically Genoa. Again, this is the Ligurian Republic, but yes, it was the French sister republic that was set up in Genoa. So pretty much is the same thing. I mean, I'll be honest, I would put Ligurian Republic F tier. I'm just going to put irrelevant, though. I feel like the Ligurian Republic contributed nothing. Okay, next there's this one. This over here is the Helvetic Republic, which I think some of you will know. This was another sister republic set up by the French revolutionaries, this time in Switzerland. Yeah, irrelevant. Okay, yeah, I agree. We're going to put Helvetic Republic in irrelevant. Now, because of the Holy Roman Empire and how freaking complicated it is, I have actually put only HRE countries on my desktop so I can remember which flag belongs to who, because otherwise I would not remember. So we'll go to my desktop now, and this is the flag of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg. Yeah, relevant. Yeah, for sure. We're putting... Yeah. All right, here is another country. If you look closely, you'll see the same symbol here. So this is Electoral Saxony. In other words, the electorate of Saxony, which is not to be confused with actual Saxony. So I'm going to put it irrelevant. Yeah. Okay, I think most of you guys should know what this country is, though, because this country still has the same flag, and it's the oldest flag in the entire world. Can I just make the HRE one thing? I thought of that, but the reason I didn't is because there are individual countries within the HRE that actually contributed a good amount. Denmark. Denmark gets F tier, bro, got bombed and then got bullied into leaving. You're partially correct. So that is how Denmark entered the Napoleonic Wars, I want to say. I think it was the third coalition. It's basically Scandinavia had this period known as the English Wars, during which the British came in and basically were trying to force the Scandinavians from stopping their trade with the French. So Horatio Nelson famously bombarded Copenhagen, and then this is what brought the Danes on the French side. And again, you'll notice Denmark was one of the earlier countries because they were a staunch French ally. But Denmark got absolutely wrecked. They performed terribly in basically all their battles. And when I say Denmark, I mean Denmark, Norway. But by the end of the Napoleonic Wars, it was just Denmark, because Denmark lost Norway to Sweden after the War of the Sixth Coalition. And so I would say, based on that alone, along with the fact that the Danes, achieved pretty much nothing and were terribly weak, means Denmark, F tier. All right, and we've checked. It is Hesse. Okay, so Hesse-Darmstadt, we are going to put Hesse-Darmstadt in A tier. Now, you might be saying, wait, what? Why is Hesse-Darmstadt in A tier? Well, Hesse-Darmstadt was pretty much one of the only confederation of the Rhine states that actually fought pretty well. As you guys know probably by now, at the end of all my tier lists, I pull up the Google Sheets showing, the victory to defeat ratio, and Hesse has a really good one. Now, obviously, I understand, most people can't name a single battle Hesse fought in, and to be honest, neither could I. But from the battles I did read, and because again, there's so many countries that can't remember all of their military achievements, Hesse did pretty well. And so now we get this country, which I think a lot of you should be able to guess. So it's Italy. So, let's explain a little bit about Italy. So, as we know, right, in my World War tier list, Italy deservedly was always in the lowest tiers because of how terribly they fought. But during Napoleon's time, Italy was, first of all, Italy did not cover most of modern Italy. Italy was basically just north-central Italy, and it was in a personal union under Napoleon. So basically, Napoleon was both the Emperor of the French and the King of Italy. Now, on top of that, what's also interesting about Italy is that the Italian army actually did very, very well. Now, part of me suspects that that's because Napoleon was its leader, but also at the same time, the Italian soldiers are just as responsible for their own fighting. And so the Italians pretty much fought with Napoleon, everywhere he went, starting in the War of the Third Coalition, I believe, up until the War of the Sixth Coalition. And they actually performed quite well. So I'm going to put Italy in A tier, something I never expected to say on this channel. All right, and next we get this country. Okay, well, I am going to be siding with Mr. LC. I am going to put Naples in F tier. And the reason why is because Naples just performed terribly all throughout this, the Napoleonic War. So basically what happened, right, Naples started off, just like the rest of Europe, in the first coalition against France. Then France invades, and then they basically established something known as the Parthenopean Republic, which was a very short-lived sister republic to France. Okay, then what happens is then the coalition invades, they reinstall the monarchy, they become a monarchy again. Then the French come back in, force Naples to become their ally, and then they eventually put Joachim Murat on the throne. And so then they're on the French side, and then pretty much the last war of the Napoleonic Wars that was going on simultaneously with 100 Days was the Austro-Neapolitan War, during which Austria invaded and crushed Naples. And we know Austria did pretty terribly, during these wars as well. So the fact that that Naples got taken over 3 different times and in no way defended well in any of those times means Naples gets an F tier. Okay, well, you're correct. Holland I'm putting in irrelevant because Holland basically contributed nothing to the Napoleonic Wars. All right, does anyone know this next one? So this is the Kingdom of Saxony. So the Kingdom of Saxony was set up during the whole Confederation of the Rhine period. It was Napoleon's ally, and then during the Battle of Leipzig, I think they were pretty much the only country to not betray the French during the Battle of Leipzig. But then eventually, they did join the coalition as well. I'm going to put Saxony C tier. They did all right. They weren't great, though. So, yeah, they're pretty meh putting them C tier. All right, next. Does anyone know this one? So, I am going to put Bavaria A tier. Now, why am I putting Bavaria A tier? The reason is because Bavaria actually did surprisingly well during the Napoleonic Wars. Basically, I think they joined during the War of the Third Coalition. And then they basically allowed the French and Napoleon to use their territory to attack Austria. They were rewarded. They were given Austrian land. Then Austria tried invading Bavaria. They failed. Then the French came in and saved them. And then they readjusted the borders, so Bavaria lost a little bit of more land. But they were solid French allies all throughout the Napoleonic Wars. Then when the Battle of Leipzig happened, and around that time, the Sixth Coalition, they switched sides. They turned against France, and so then they were rewarded. So Bavaria was very skillful during this war. All right, Next, does anyone know this one? I think most people should be able to guess which country this was. All right, so I am going to put Warsaw, first country, in our B tier. And here's the reason why. Warsaw actually did quite well. The reason Warsaw was established in the first place was because of the Great Polish Uprising that happened during the War of the Fifth Coalition, I believe, or no, Fourth Coalition. Well, as Napoleon was invading Prussia, they fought against the Prussians. Napoleon rewarded them, created their country. And they actually did quite well. Austria invaded them separately, and then they were able to defend land and conquer land from Austria. And they were very good and loyal French allies. There were a surprising amount of Polish troops in the Peninsular War. I didn't realize that. And they participated a lot there. And then, of course, they participated in the invasion of Russia. And, well, after that, you can imagine the Russians weren't too happy, and then they steamrolled Warsaw. So if it wasn't for the fact that, they got just crushed by Russia at the end, I would have put Warsaw as A tier, but because of that, they have to be put in B tier. All right, so I already spoiled this next one, Westphalia. I'm going to put Westphalia C tier. Westphalia is very similar to Saxony. Like, they did fairly well. They were, decently reliable member of the Confederation of the Rhine, but they weren't crazy or anything, so yeah. Next, we have this country. I'd be very surprised if anyone knows this. Yeah, so this country is called Berg. Yeah, so Berg, irrelevant. No one knows what Berg did, right? Okay, next we have this country. I think every single person should be able to recognize it. And it's a country that also played a very important role during the war. So I am interested to see what we think of this country. Let's look at what Spain did, right? So Spain joined the first coalition against France, and then they lost pretty badly. So then they switched sides, right? So not the best start. And then, they joined the war of the second coalition, and then the war of the third coalition too. And so in the war of the third coalition, they're fighting against the British, and basically Napoleon decides to request to use their fleet to invade Britain once and for all. And so, they're sort of assembling there at Trafalgar. And as we all know, right, Nelson just destroys the Franco-Spanish fleet at Trafalgar, right? So it's not a good look either, right? So they're getting destroyed at Trafalgar. They get destroyed in the War of the First Coalition. But then, as I explained right at the beginning of the video, something interesting happens where Napoleon basically occupies Spain, and he basically set up the King of Spain and his son, took them as hostages, and then installed his brother Joseph as a king. And the Spanish were having none of that. So the Spanish were like, nah, we're not accepting this. So in 1808, they basically joined the Peninsular War along with their Portuguese brothers and resist French rule. Now, up until now, I would give the Spanish C tier. But because the Spanish actually were able to resist very well against Napoleon and his troops, it was the first time that I would say Napoleon suffered any real significant defeats. And also because the Spanish didn't just capitulate, but they kept resisting all the way until 1814, I'm going to put Spain as B tier for that. All right, next there's this country. Wurttemberg is going to be put in A tier. You'll be like, wait a second, why are you in Wurttemberg A tier? Well, sort of like Hesse, Wurttemberg was one of the few French allies that was actually pretty good. They won a lot of victories, and they overall did pretty well during the Napoleonic Wars. And especially given their small size, it is pretty impressive. So that's why they're A tier. All right, next we have this country over here. No, but we are going to put Baden irrelevant because, yeah, nobody cares. Yeah, so let's do a little explanation for this. This is clearly not a flag. This is a map. I would be super surprised if anyone knew what country this was based on the map. But this was a country that was so irrelevant, I couldn't even find a flag for it. So that's why it's here. This is Saxe-Coburg-Saalfled, which I'm sure you guys all know the detailed history of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfled. All right, so moving on, we now get this country, which is just Saxony, but upside down. It is Saxe-Meiningen. Yeah. Now, I'm not going to waste your guys' time. I think we all know Saxe-Meiningen played no role, We're putting Saxe-Meiningen in irrelevant too. This is Saxe-Hildburghausen. So we're going to put Saxe-Hildburghausen as irrelevant. All right, next we have this country. And we know it's a Saxon country because this, and this are all the same. So anyone knows which country this one is? It's Anhalt. Yes. Yes, so Sir Welsh has the actual answer, which is that's the Grand Duchy of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Do I care about Mecklenburg? No. So, no, it's not that I don't care. They did nothing. So Mecklenburg, Schwerin, also going irrelevant. Okay, guys, now finally we get to an interesting country. We've done a lot of these useless HRE countries. So, Ottomans, guys. I will put the Ottomans as our first D tier country. So why am I putting the Ottomans so low? Well, first of all, as we know, right, by now, by like the late 1700s, the Ottomans just sucked. Like their military was bad, so it's not that surprising. Same thing as World War I. I also put them in D tier. And, you know, most of what people think about the Ottomans is, okay, yeah, Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. And that is pretty important. You know, that's why they joined the War of the Second Coalition. Now, you might say, okay, they beat the French, and that's true. They were able to kick them out, but that's for a couple of reasons. One, the French were just overextended. You know, they were out in the middle of nowhere. Two, Napoleon just abandoned his men and snuck out. Three, there was quite a lot of local resistance. And actually a big part of that was because the Ottomans were unable to properly defend Egypt. And, you know, the French were able to stay there for quite a while, you know, before a lot of them, you know, died of plague and all that. But it's not just the failure against the French. The Russians also invaded the Ottomans. And this time they were actually being supported by the French because there was a Prince of Wallachia, I think. And basically the pro-Ottoman one died, and then they were trying to get a new pro-Ottoman prince. And then the Russians were like, no, we want our own pro-Russian prince. So the Russians and the Ottomans go to war, and the Russians quickly occupy Romania. So the Ottomans did terribly against the Russians. And then seeing this defeat, the Serbs actually rose up against the Ottomans. And the Serbs were able to were pretty much able to kick out the Ottomans from, you know, their little area of Serbia. And it took the Ottomans, I think, 9 years to finally subjugate Serbia, and only somewhat, because in the end Serbia ended up as an Ottoman vassal. And so actually the dissolution, really, the Ottoman Empire sort of starts with the first Serbian uprising, because it inspired all the other Balkan peoples to start fighting for their own freedom. And we'd see that later with Greece. So because of all those reasons, Ottomans, you know, sorry to say it to you, proud Turk, they get D. All right, and now, of course, we get the country that pretty much all my audience is from, the United States of America. I will explain a little bit why the US is even here on this list and what exactly I am looking for when I talk about America's contribution. I am going to talk about America. So basically, with America, we're talking about two wars here, the Quasi-War, which was a war, and then we're talking about the War of 1812. So that's really mainly what I'm basing this tier list ranking off of, the War of 1812. Now, as Americans, and then also me as a Canadian, I'm not going to go into that war. I think you guys all know what it is. You can check out my History of Canada video in case you don't know. And the Quasi-War, perhaps you're a bit less familiar with it. It's basically, again, there was a bunch of trade disputes, and the French wanted the Americans to pay back their debt, and then the Americans were like, no, you know, you're not a kingdom anymore, so we don't owe you debt. So there's a small naval war between the Americans and the French over that. Might surprise you. I'm actually going to put America B tier, and the reason why is because, and keep in mind, right, I'm Canadian, I would naturally be biased against the US and want to put them lower, especially because this was kind of like our only like war of independence. But objectively, America didn't do that bad in the War of 1812. You know, they were able to preserve their territory. They were able to achieve their goal, which was to get the British to stop impressing their sailors, and not in the sense of like, oh, I'm impressive. You know what it means, like basically kidnapping sailors. And the American Navy did surprisingly well. I think the U.S. won more battles than they lost during the. They won more battles than they lost during the War of 1812. But the reason I could not put America as A tier was because they were trying to conquer Canada and completely failed. Now, on one hand, conquering Canada wasn't too hard. On the other hand, though, this was, the United Kingdom, which was the most powerful country in the world other than France at the time. And the fact that they still couldn't conquer Canada, even when Britain was completely focused on beating the French, does say a lot. That's why I put America in B tier, and honestly, I'd say low B tier. They might even, they're close to C tier. All right, so next is Serbia. I explained already a little bit with the Ottomans, but basically what happened was that during the Russo-Ottoman War, the Serbs rose up in rebellion, and this is known as the First Serbian Uprising. And as I said, it took the Ottomans, I think, like 9 years to crush them, and even after that, they only somewhat succeeded. So already, you can imagine, I'm putting revolutionary Serbia higher. But when you look at the amount of battles the Serbians won too, it's crazy. Like, the Serbians basically won almost every battle, and then it was only at the very end, when the tide was turning and everyone was distracted fighting the French, the Ottomans were able to reconquer Serbia. And they were led by this guy called Karađorđe, and if it wasn't for the fact that he was a bit too power hungry and people were having, inner factions and fighting amongst each other, Serbs would have done better. So the Serbs would have gotten S tier, but because they lost, they get A tier. But still pretty good, I have to say. So there we go. There's a little A tier. All right, next we have Iran. Basically what happened with Iran was that Russia went to war with Iran, and this was actually the war because they were arguing about like who controlled like Georgia, I believe. So they went to war over it, and then Russia decisively won, and that's how they ended up having that border with Iran, where Russia controlled all of the Caucasus, including Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. So yeah, we are going to be putting Iran, irrelevant tier. I would put them F tier, but they did so little, it kind of doesn't matter. All right, next we have this country. I think some of you will recognize which one it is. All right, yeah, so we're going to put Montenegro irrelevant as well. All right, this one's a bit more interesting. All right, well, I'm going to tell you what it is. So this country is Norway. Does anyone know what Norway did during the Napoleonic Wars? Norway specifically was only involved in one war against Denmark, and that's actually why they had like the similar to the Danish flag, because like they're breaking off from Denmark, but they sort of kept a lot of similarities. Same way that like the USA's blue, red, and white is based on the blue, red, and white of the British. All right, well, we are putting Norway in F tier. I think. Oh, I hate how this works, bruh. Nah, actually, we'll put D tier. Okay, so basically what happened is Norway went to war. It has the Danish flag here, but it didn't go to war with Denmark. And then it went to war with Sweden, because basically what happened is that after the wars, like after War Six coalition, as I said, Denmark got crushed, and so they lost Norway. But they lost Norway to Sweden. But the Norwegians basically were like, hey, stop using our country as just like a bargaining chip between, like as a bargaining chip between you guys. So they're like, we're not going to accept being under Sweden. The Swedes invaded and crushed the Norwegians. So yeah, that's why they get D tier. All right, next we have this country. It's Piedmont, actually. Yeah, it's Piedmont, which is right next to France. And basically the history of Piedmont is this. During the wars. Basically, during the War of the First Coalition, Piedmont joined the First Coalition. They were right next to France. They were the first country taken over. I don't know if it was Napoleon at that time or not, but they just got crushed. That was the Kingdom of Sardinia. And then basically the French set up a sister republic known as Piedmont, I believe, the Piedmontese Republic. But they did nothing, so irrelevant tier. Another one. We got this country, which I think is kind of cool. It has the little wheel thing. It's Mainz, yeah. So, to no one's surprise, Mainz also kind of did nothing. And so we're putting Mainz in irrelevant tier. Okay, this one's a bit more interesting. I am going to put Sicily B tier. So why? Okay, come on. Why is this so slow? Okay, B tier. So why is Sicily B tier? Well, the reason I'm putting Sicily B tier is they did fairly well. I mean, so we talked about how Naples is an F tier because of how badly they did. Well, the reason that the coalition was even able to retake Naples at all was specifically because they would base their invasions in Sicily. And so there were two invasions coming out of Sicily to Naples. So the fact that the Neapolitans were never able to defend from the Sicilians and their allies already means the Sicilians weren't too bad. And the Sicilians never got taken over by the French, which is also a boost, especially given that they took over Naples. But they weren't particularly good either, so that's why I'm giving them B. Like, more good than bad, but meh. Alright. Now we get to this country over here. Yeah, Netherlands, yep, that's correct. And you might be saying, hey, haven't we done the Netherlands twice? We did the Batavian Republic and we did Holland. But again, these were all different countries. Dutch Republic, pre-Napoleonic, or pre-revolutionary. Batavia, revolutionary, and then Holland, post-revolutionary and Napoleonic. So Dutch Republic, we are going to put them D tier. So the Dutch Republic actually won a good amount of battles, especially overseas. So we're talking about Indonesia and naval battles. But at the same time, the Dutch Republic just got completely overrun by the French and then just got destroyed. This is the reason the Dutch aren't a republic anymore. And so because of that, they get D tier. This one's interesting. All right, so this one is the Papal States. The Papal States kind of did nothing, to be honest. They got invaded once by Napoleon. There was a brief republic set up called the Roman Republic. And then they went back to being left alone as long as they served Napoleon's interests, so the Pope crowned Napoleon. So we're putting Papal States irrelevant. They kind of did nothing. Okay, this country should be pretty obvious. Switzerland got invaded by the French, just like the Papal States, and then they set up a republic, right? That's the Helvetic Republic. And they didn't really do that much. They also get irrelevant. Okay, next we have this one. This one looks very similar to the Danish flag, but you can see it's more in the middle. So this is Malta. The nice hospitaller ran that country. They also got invaded, taken over by the French, and then later the British took it, which is why Malta became a British colony. So yeah, it is one of the few examples of a European country that was explicitly a colony. But yeah, they did almost nothing. Next was this one. This is actually probably the coolest flag out of all the ones that I've seen so far. Yes, Tuscany. So as you can imagine, Grand Duchy of Tuscany, not really much to say. So we are moving on to here. Then we have this country. I recognize one. Okay, so this one is Basel. Not even going to discuss it. Basel is irrelevant. Okay, so this next one is Palatinate. And yeah, I think you guys can imagine the Palatinate kind of did nothing. So we are also putting them in irrelevant tier. Duchy of Brunswick-Luneburg. Let's see if he's correct. Yes, he's correct. And as you can imagine, Duchy of Brunswick-Luneburg did nothing. So we are putting them irrelevant tier as well. This is Hesse-Darmstadt. So yeah, good job. Hesse-Darmstadt. Also irrelevant. Kind of did nothing. Alrighty. Sorry, I know this is tedious. We're almost done with the HRE, guys. I promise. A lot of pretty useless countries here. Of course, but... Grand Duchy of Nassau. Yes. Yes, it is. It is. Dang, it's been 100 minutes. We're still in the HRE, guys. Alright, yeah. Nassau gets a solid irrelevant because no one cares what Nassau did. Alright, finally we get the last or second last irrelevant HRE country. Okay, so this one is Ragusa. And so this one's interesting. It's actually not HRE, this is on the coast of Croatia. City-state there. Okay, guys. Now we are done with the irrelevant countries other than this one, but we'll go over it quickly. And so now we can finally get to the interesting part. So Hanover, we are going to put Hanover D tier. So as many of you guys probably know, Hanover was ruled by the British. Why? Well, because the British were being ruled by the House of Hanover. So they were obviously based in Hanover. Now, the French weren't stupid. They recognized this. And so because Britain was their main enemy during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, they decided to invade Hanover. And so George III was the ruler of Hanover, but he was also King of England. And basically, Hanover didn't do much. They kind of just got overrun. They didn't offer much of a defense, and then they were sort of forced to be under French and then Prussian control, but then back under French control, and so that created issue with Prussia. So yeah, Hanover did pretty badly. And speaking of Prussia, guys, by the way, now we got to, finally a great power that actually did a lot during these wars. This is Prussia. I am going to put Prussia in D tier. Why is that the case? Well, because first of all, you have to remember, Prussia was just crazy throughout the 18th century. I mean, they came out of nowhere. They just decided to attack Austria one day during the War of the Austrian Succession. They took Silesia from them. Then they successfully defended it during the 7 Years' War. They were fighting all the big countries of Europe. They were fighting the French. They were fighting the Austrians. They were fighting the Russians. The British were on their sides, but they couldn't really do much, especially in terms of the army. So, under Frederick the Great, the Prussians were crazy. And then you watch as the Prussians just get steamrolled by the French, and it's crazy. I mean, you look at the War of the Fourth Coalition. The Prussians declare, war on France, and just within months and weeks, they are completely overrun. Almost their entire country is occupied. They have to give their Polish land to the Duchy of Warsaw. They have to give up Hanover. They have to give up most of their western land. And so Prussia lost over 60% of its land and territory. And so that alone already makes Prussia pretty bad. I mean, they failed in the first coalition. I think they didn't join the second coalition and third because they'd failed so badly in the first. And sure, yeah, of course they won out because France got defeated eventually, but they were fighting with all of Europe. So I think Prussia deserves D tier. I am going to put Sardinia in F tier. Why? Because Sardinia was a complete joke. So yes, this is Sardinia, Piedmont. They also control Piedmont. And basically what happened is that the French, they overrun Sardinia, Piedmont, hence why they could even install the Piedmontese Republic, which, again, I put in irrelevant. Of course, they did join the last coalition against the French, the sixth one, and maybe the seventh one too. But they were basically just steamrolled by the French, offered very low resistance, and lost most of their battles. And actually, now that I think about it, because Sardinia was the country that unified Italy, Italy gets another F tier. So I think this is the third time, though maybe World War I gave them D. But either way, this is the third time, guys, that Italy is the complete bottom. So, maybe if the Kingdom of Italy had united Italy, or, maybe if some other country united Italy. But yeah, Sardinia, they've been failing long before Italy was a thing. All right, and now, guys, we get to perhaps the most important country in the Napoleonic Wars other than Britain and France, which is Austria. I will put Austria C tier, and this is why. Now, Austria was not that bad during the wars. I mean, they were able to fight in most coalitions. They started the first coalition. They were fighting in the second coalition. They fought in the third one, I think. Maybe the fourth one, although I'm not sure. And then they definitely fought in the sixth and seventh coalitions. But they didn't perform that well. I mean, the first coalition, they lost Belgium to the French. They also lost very badly during the second coalition in Italy. During the first and second coalition in Italy to Napoleon. During the third coalition, they famously got defeated at Austerlitz. There were other battles, Aspern, Essling, other big battles, most of which they lost. And so Austria, is not very impressive in terms of how it fared. And each time they would lose more and more land. So they eventually, Vienna was occupied by Napoleon. They eventually lost Croatia directly to France. They lost their control over all of northern Italy. And so they lost more and more land. They lost land to Warsaw too. And they were even forced to somewhat help in the invasion of Russia. But at the same time, though, Austria kept trying and trying no matter what. So you do have to give them credit for that. And unlike Prussia, they weren't just completely destroyed. And so basically, I'd say Austria is in between Spain and Prussia. Prussia just got crushed. Spain at least resisted. Austria was somewhere in the middle. They took a lot of L's, but they were fairly resilient. All right, next we have this country, which again is another Saxon country, in case you guys couldn't tell by now. Yes, this Saxe-Weimar, irrelevant. All right, guys, so now this is going to be interesting. I am going to put Russia in B tier. So why is Russia B tier? Well, Russia obviously did pretty well. I mean, they're the main reason that the entire Napoleonic and French Revolutionary Wars came to an end, because the invasion possibly mainly because the invasion went horribly. But at the same time, it was not so much the actions of the Russian army themselves, but rather it was mainly the weather, the poor logistics, and the scorched earth policy. And so, of course, the Russians do deserve credit for that. But at the same time, that pales in comparison to actually being the enemy on the battlefield, such as what Spain was doing a lot more of. Additionally, Russia's huge, so they did have that advantage. But at the same time, everyone agrees that Russia is irrespective of what you think, primarily responsible for the downfall of Napoleon. Although it is also a lot of just Napoleon's fault for invading. But looking just at Russia's actions in a more broad sense, I mean, they fought, I think, in the Second Coalition. They fought against the Ottomans and were winning there. They were very shrewd. They were like allying with Napoleon, and then they switched sides. But also, they were also beaten by Napoleon at Austerlitz. They were beaten by Napoleon at Friedland. So we don't want to give the Russians too high of a thing. So I'd say B tier, because like Spain, they did fairly well, but could have been better. And yeah, now I just realized the highest I've ever given Russia in any of these tier lists. Okay, now guys, we finally get to the 3 countries that I would say truly deserve to have been called the actual enemies of France, in the sense that these 3 countries never sided really with France at all, and always resisted till the end. And also because I'm personally biased against the French, these are all countries that I admire. But we're starting off with Sweden here, of course. I'm going to put Sweden solid C tier. Why? Because basically, on one hand, the Swedes resisted determinedly against Napoleon quite a lot. Back when Russia was allied with France, they actually fought the Finnish War and took Finland away from Sweden. But at the same time, the Swedes were the British only allies, and so they were putting a lot on the line. So they did lose a lot of Finland, which is why I can't give them too high of a score. But at the same time, they did also resist pretty much completely alone, and so you do have to give them credit for that, which is why I'm not putting them D tier. Additionally, they were able to not only gain but conquer successfully Norway after the war of the Sixth Coalition in the Sweden-Norwegian War. So because of that, I'd say they're very much average, so we put them as C tier. Okay, finally, again, very close, Portugal. Again, don't know how much Nioski and Julius know, but I think Portugal played quite an important role. I would have put Portugal in A tier. And the reason why is because, Portugal was basically resisting alone against Napoleon. They refused to join the continental system and blockade against Britain, which was their oldest ally and still is their ally. It's the oldest alliance in the world. They were surrounded by Spain, and yet Spain was never really able to take them over. And during the Peninsular War, they resisted very well against the French. But because the French were briefly able to completely take over their country, that's why I have to put Portugal in B tier instead of A tier. And so what happened is that the Portuguese royal family actually fled just hours before Napoleon arrived to Brazil. And so then the son of the King of Portugal, Pedro I, grew up in Brazil and felt that he was more of a Brazilian than a Portuguese, which is why when the Portuguese family had to return, and they were very reluctant to, because after all, who would rather live in Portugal than Brazil? The father returned, but Pedro refused, and he actually led Brazil's independence against Portugal. So it's a very interesting side note. But yeah, that's why I put in Portugal as B tier. All right. And finally, and I do want to actually hear everyone's opinions here, because this is the most important country in the tier list, other than France. Let's look at what the United Kingdom, well, okay, Great Britain and the United Kingdom became the United Kingdom during the wars. So what did the United Kingdom do during the wars? Well, as Sir Welch pointed out, they were the only country that participated in every single war against France. They didn't technically lead every coalition, but they were the only country to have been in all 7 coalitions. They never stopped fighting the French, even when they were completely alone. It very much gives World War II vibes. And if it was not for the British, Napoleon almost certainly would have won. Because you might say, okay, but he invaded Russia. But he invaded Russia because they were trading with Britain. So if it wasn't for Britain happening, he wouldn't have needed to invade Russia. So Britain is the primary reason why Napoleon ended up losing. Now, Britain came close to being invaded because Napoleon had plans to invade Britain, but just like Hitler, a long time later, he failed because of the power of the British Navy. And again, Horatio Nelson really is a hero because of the fact that he was able to quash all dreams of that at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. So, definitely for the fact that they were in every coalition, never gave up, and for some time were the only country fighting means that they already have to be very high. In addition, too, they performed very well. They won a large amount of the battles, and they pretty much dominated the waves. And so you might say, okay, definitely S tier, right? The only reason, though, I'm a bit hesitant about that is just because Britain, at least for most of the time, had allies the entire time. And without those allies, I don't think they would have ever beaten the French either. And so unlike France, which was fighting all of Europe alone, Britain at least had a lot of allies. So I'm going to be putting Britain A tier. So this is very hard because it's so close to S tier, but the only reason I didn't put it S tier is just because France was just on such another league that I couldn't put it in the same league as anyone else. And that is pretty much the reason why, but it's super close. So it's like very high A tier basically, or like low S tier. Okay, and so yeah, guys, that's it for the tier list. France on the top, Hesse, Italy, Bavaria, Wurttemberg, Serbia, United Kingdom A, Warsaw, Spain, United States, Sicily, Russia, Portugal B tier. We have Saxony, Westphalia, Austria, Sweden C tier, Ottomans, Norway, Dutch Republic, Hanover, Prussia D tier, Batavian Republic, Denmark, Naples, and Sardinia F tier, and then all the rest of these are irrelevant. So yeah, guys, tell me what you think. Tell me if you think there are like any major disagreements or agreements that you have with this. And then we're gonna get to the last part where I look at the victory and defeat ratios. So there is a lot of countries here, as you can see. Boom, 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 boom. But obviously, a lot of these, like Berg, fought 2 battles, or Ragusa. So obviously, we're not going to be looking at all of them. We're only going to be looking at the ones that fought enough battles where it becomes relevant. All right, so let's look at Spain. So as we can see, Spain won 42% of their battles, 3% inconclusive, 53% defeats. So yeah, 75 victories, 96 losses. So okay, it's not great. France, despite everything that happened, despite fighting 8 coalitions, they had the exact same amount of victories as defeats. Think about this. France won 316 battles and lost 316 battles. And that's just poetic to me. Like, that's almost crazy that there's a perfect ratio between the amount of French victories and defeats. Like, this is truly insane. And then they had 40 battles that were inconclusive. But yeah, that's just crazy. Let's just check the chat. Is there anyone still in the chat, by the way? Just wondering. Okay, then we get to the UK. So the UK, great margin here. 60% victories, a third defeats, the rest are inconclusive. And yeah, they won 244 victories and then lost 134 defeats. Austria, very much meh. Lost slightly more than they won. Won 110, lost 124. 6 inconclusive. Prussia. Now you see, it's interesting, right? Because Prussia, the only reason I didn't put Prussia in F tier for how terribly they performed is because they won so many battles. They actually won more battles than they lost. They won 46, and they only lost 34. But at the same time, because of Prussia's just political developments and all that, this ratio could only change things so much. Now, this is why I put Sardinia F tier. And remember, guys, Sardinia is what formed Italy. 81% defeats, guys. 81%. Lost 13 battles, only won 3. That's crazy. No inconclusive either. Netherlands, again, this is interesting. Netherlands, by this I mean like the Dutch Republic and also the Netherlands after 1814. Where it's interesting because, again, like Prussia, the only reason it was not put in F tier is because it won a lot of battles, 12 victories versus 8 defeats. But at the same time, though, they got completely overrun. Next, Saxony. Very split, basically. 14 victories, 15 defeats. Hanover. So Hanover had, a bit more defeats than victories, which is why I think I put it C tier. It's taking so long to load. Oh, D tier, actually. I think this is because they also got overrun. But yeah, more defeats, 9 defeats versus 7 victories. Hesse-Kassel. Hesse-Kassel is the same as Sardinia. Look at how bad that ratio is. 81% defeats, 18% victories. So again, 9 defeats, 2 victories. Naples. Naples also did awful. I mean, you just look how bad they were. 21 defeats to only 8 victories. So 70% defeats. Yeah, it's pretty bad. Next, Sicily. Sicily did a good job, 6 defeats or 6 victories, 4 defeats. Portugal. Portugal, you see, this is why I admire Portugal. Pretty good ratio. 55% victories, 36% defeats. Russia. Basically half of Russian battles were won, right? Around 40% were lost, and then a good amount were inconclusive. So 84 victories, 68 defeats. And then 17 inconclusive. Batavian Republic. I mean, just like Hesse-Kassel and Sardinia, the Batavian Republic, I put in F tier as a total joke. 78% defeats. That's 15 defeats to only 4 victories. Bavaria, put in A tier because it did quite well. I mean, you look 57% victories, won 15 victories, and only lost 9 defeats. Now, US, and this is sort of what I was talking about. The US actually won more battles than it lost. So it had 54% victories and only 39% defeats. So it won 68 battles and then lost 49, with 8 being inconclusive. Ottomans. Now, this is crazy. Look how bad the Ottomans did. 65% defeats and only 34% victories. So 21 defeats versus 11 victories. Sweden, again, very meh. 49% victories, 40% defeats. And you might say, isn't that the same as Russia? That's true, but Russia contributed a lot more to the victory. Italy. Again, this is why I was saying Italy was like one of, if not the best French ally. 64% victories, so 22 victories, and only 11 defeats, so 32%. Denmark, just getting ratioed out here. Denmark lost 58% of its battles, only won 29%, so that's pretty bad. Wurttemberg, again, just like Bavaria, did quite well. 57% victories, 31% defeats. So Wurttemberg won 11 battles, only lost 6, had 2 inconclusives. Hesse also did pretty well with 55% victories and 33% defeats. So won 5, lost 3, 1 was inconclusive. Oh, Serbia. Now this is why I was saying Serbia had to be A tier. Look at this, 87% victories and only 12% defeats. So it is only 7 versus 1, but again, 1 defeat in their entire upbringing, 1 defeat. All right, and then we get to the last 3. Westphalia, Westphalia is there, sorry. Warsaw won more battles than it lost. Warsaw won 53%, so 14 victories, 10 defeats. Westphalia, meh, they lost half their battles, in other words, 5, 1, 4, and then had 1 inconclusive. And yeah, Norway did pretty terribly too, 62% defeats because they lost 5 battles and only won 2, and 1 is inconclusive. And yeah, so that's it, guys. Hope you learned something. Hope you learned something new. Hope you found it interesting. I certainly learned so much about the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars because there's so many countries and it's not something I'm as familiar with as compared to the World Wars. But yeah, glad you liked it. And of course, thank you to World Builders Ministries, Historia Judaica, and Sir Welch for sticking it through the entire 2 hours. I very much appreciate it.